The world outside the stagecoach window had bled its color away months ago. Green had been the first to die, surrendering the rolling hills of Louisiana to the stubborn brown of East Texas. Then the brown itself grew thin, stretched taut over a landscape of rock and sand that shimmered under a pale, merciless sky. For 3 days, the only movement had been the rhythmic sway of the coach and the slow circling of buzzards, patient as undertakers. Clara Bell pressed her forehead against the cool, grimy glass. The dust was a living thing out here. It worked its way through the leather seams of the coach, settled in a fine red film on her dark traveling dress, and coated her tongue with the taste of grit and distance. It was nothing like the damp, heavy air of New Orleans, an atmosphere thick with the scent of jasmine, decay, and secrets. She had traded a beautiful, gilded cage for an endless, empty plain, and for the first time in 1,000 miles, a sliver of doubt pierced the armor of her resolve. New Orleans had been a city of ghosts, the ghost of her father, a man with charm in his smile and ruin in his cards, who had left his family with nothing but a name whispered with contempt in the city's parlors, the ghost of her mother, whose beauty had been her currency and her downfall, a woman who sang in smoky rooms for the pleasure of men who would never receive her in their homes. Clara, with her quiet books and her plain face, had been the respectable daughter, the one meant to wash the stain clean, but the stain of the Bell name was indelible, a brand that marked her no matter how virtuously she lived. Every suitor who came calling was eventually scared away by the whispers. Every respectable family that might have hired her as a governess found a more suitable candidate at the last moment. She was a Bell, and in New Orleans, that meant she was damaged goods, a piece of fine porcelain with a crack running right through it. The letter from Dry Gulch, Texas, had felt like a reprieve from a life sentence. A Reverend Michael Thompson, writing on behalf of the town council, sought a schoolteacher. The advertisement had been months old, passed from a parson in Shreveport to another in Natchez, until it finally found its way to a charity board in the Crescent City. They needed someone of strong moral character, willing to face the hardships of the frontier. Pay was modest, lodging provided. No questions were asked about her family. Clara had clung to those words, no questions asked. It was a promise of a blank slate, a place where the name Bell meant nothing, where she could be judged only by the work of her hands and the contents of her mind. She sold the last of her mother's jewelry, packed her life into a single heavy trunk and a small leather satchel, and bought a one-way ticket west. She did not look back. The coachman's gruff voice cut through her reverie. "Dry Gulch, end of the line." The stagecoach groaned to a halt, the sudden silence deafening after weeks of rattling wheels and creaking leather. Clara straightened her bonnet, her gloved fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed the wrinkles from her skirt. She took a deep, steadying breath, the dry air sharp in her lungs. This was it, the beginning. The coachman, a barrel-chested man named Silas with a beard stained by tobacco, swung the door open. He didn't offer a hand, merely grunted and moved to unstrap her trunk from the roof. Clara gathered her satchel and descended the steep steps herself, her boots landing with a soft thud in the thick dust of the town's main street. And then she stood, utterly still, waiting. The silence that had seemed a relief inside the coach was a different beast out here. It was heavy, watchful. Dry Gulch was little more than a single, wide scar of a street carved through the wilderness. On either side stood a collection of sun-bleached, false-fronted buildings, a general store with a sagging porch, a saloon whose bat-wing doors hung slightly askew, a blacksmith's forge, dark and quiet, and a handful of other nondescript structures that seemed to be holding their breath. At the far end of the street, a small, white church with a humble steeple pointed a finger at the vast, indifferent sky. There were people. A woman in a faded calico dress froze mid-step, a basket on her hip. 2 men leaning against the horse trough stopped their whittling, their knives still. A face peered from the grimy window of the general store, then vanished. They were all looking at her, a solitary figure in a dark dress. An alien creature dropped into their world of dust and hardship. Clara's heart, which had been beating with a nervous anticipation, slowed to a heavy, painful thud. She had read of frontier towns, of welcoming committees, of a community eager for the civilizing touch of education. Her letter was from a Reverend Thompson. Surely he would be here, or perhaps a member of the town council. Someone. No one moved. No one spoke. The only welcome was a dust devil that spun lazily in the middle of the street, a phantom dancing for an audience of one. The sun beat down on her head, its heat relentless. Silas dropped her trunk to the ground with a heavy thump that echoed in the quiet. He wiped his brow with the back of a hand, spat a stream of brown juice into the dust, and climbed back onto his seat without a word or a backward glance. With a crack of the whip and a jingle of harnesses, the stagecoach rumbled on, leaving her behind in a cloud of red dust and profound isolation. She was alone, utterly, completely alone. The feeling was a cold shock, a dousing of icy water that extinguished the last embers of her hopeful fantasies. This wasn't a blank slate. It was a wall. The stares of the townspeople were not curious. They were hard, suspicious, and dismissive. In their eyes, she was not a teacher, a bearer of knowledge. She was an outsider, a woman who had arrived alone, with one trunk and no one to claim her. In a world this harsh, that was a sin in itself. It spoke of desperation, of a past that had to be run from. They had already written her story, and it was no doubt as sordid as the one she'd left behind. A wave of panic, sharp and sickening, rose in her throat. She could run. She could scream for the stagecoach to stop, to take her back. But back to what? To the pitying glances and closed doors of New Orleans. To a life spent as a ghost in her own home. No. The thought was not a shout, but a whisper of steel in the core of her being. She had not survived her family's ruin, had not endured the long, lonely journey, only to be broken by silence. Her chin lifted, her shoulders, which had slumped in disappointment, straightened. They could stare, they could judge. She had her letter. She had a contract. She had a right to be here. She looked down at her gloved hands, then slowly, deliberately, began to pull the fine leather from her fingers. The gloves were a relic of another life, a life of pretense and suffocating propriety. Here, they were useless. She tucked them into her reticule, her bare hands feeling strangely vulnerable in the dry, hot air. Her gaze swept across the silent town one more time, not in defiance, but in assessment. The saloon doors swung slightly in the breeze, and she could hear the faint clink of a glass, the low murmur of a voice. The general store's window was empty now, but she felt the weight of eyes upon her. The woman with the basket had turned and was walking away. Her pace hurried. They would not help her. They would not welcome her. So be it. She would have to forge her own place here, stone by stubborn stone. Clara left the heavy trunk where it lay. It contained her past, her books, her few good dresses, the daguerreotype of a mother she both loved and resented. She would deal with it later. Right now. She needed only what was essential. Gripping the handle of her small satchel, which held her papers and the last of her money, she took a single, deliberate step forward. Her heel clicked on the edge of the wooden boardwalk, the sound unnaturally loud. It was the first sound she had made, the first claim she had staked in this desolate, silent place. She walked toward the church, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the steeple. If God had a house in Dry Gulch, that was where she would start. She would find the Reverend Thompson. She would demand the position she was promised. She would build her school, even if she had to do it with her own 2 hands. She did not look at the faces that watched her pass. She did not need to. She could feel their judgment like the heat of the sun on her skin. But for the first time in her life, the feeling was not accompanied by shame. It was met with a cold, hard resolve. They did not know her. They did not know the strength that had been forged in the fires of disgrace. They would learn. Chapter 2. The Cowboy at the Edge of Town. The church was a shell. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light slanting through the tall, unadorned windows, illuminating empty pews and a simple wooden pulpit. There was no sign of life, save for a field mouse that darted across the floorboards and vanished into a crack. The air was cool and still, smelling of dry wood and forgotten hymns. It offered sanctuary from the sun, but no answers. Clara found the parsonage behind the church, a small, neat-looking house with a withered rose bush clinging to a trellis by the door. She knocked, the sound echoing in the oppressive quiet. She waited, knocked again, louder this time. Finally, a window creaked open in the house next door. A woman with a face like a dried apple peered out, her expression pinched and unwelcoming. "He ain't here," the woman said, her voice thin and reedy. "Reverend's gone to Fort Worth. Circuit business. Won't be back till week's end." Clara's heart sank. "But he sent for me. The letter promised lodging." The woman's eyes narrowed, taking in Clara's city-made dress and the exhaustion etched on her face. "Lodging's the old room behind the saloon. Council pays for it." She gestured vaguely down the street with a bony chin. "Keys with Jedediah, the barkeep." The saloon. Of all the places, it had to be the saloon. A fresh wave of dismay washed over Clara, so potent it almost buckled her knees. A respectable woman did not set foot in such an establishment, but her trunk was still sitting in the dust. The sun was beginning its slow, searing descent toward the horizon, and the entire town was watching to see if she would break. She had no choice. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice tight. The woman merely sniffed and shut the window with a decisive thud, squaring her shoulders. Clara walked back down the boardwalk, her steps measured. Each building she passed felt like a silent juror. The saloon, the thirsty spur, was even more forbidding up close. The batwing doors, weathered to a silver gray, offered glimpses into a shadowy interior from which spilled the sounds of rough male laughter and the sour smell of spilled whiskey. For a moment, she hesitated. This was a line she had never crossed, but the memory of the judging eyes, of the stagecoach disappearing in a cloud of dust, hardened her resolve. She was no longer the fragile belle of New Orleans, bound by 1,000 suffocating rules. She was a woman alone in Dry Gulch, and survival had its own, harsher etiquette. She pushed through the doors. The noise inside ceased instantly, as if a wire had been cut. Every head turned. The room was larger than she'd expected, and darker, thick with blue-gray smoke that stung her eyes. A dozen men were scattered around rough-hewn tables or standing at the long, scarred bar. They were cowboys, prospectors, drifters, men whose faces were maps of hard living. Their eyes narrowed in unison at the sight of her. In a corner booth, sitting alone, a man didn't turn his head. He was facing the room, a half-empty glass of whiskey before him, and his stillness was more commanding than the sudden motion of the others. He wore a plain, dark shirt and worn denim pants. A low-slung gun belt rested on his hips, the leather old and oiled, the handle of the Colt pistol smooth with use. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing dark, unruly hair. He seemed utterly disconnected from the room, a shadow observing the firelight. Clara ignored the stares and focused on the man behind the bar, a portly fellow with a stained apron and a suspender straining over his ample belly. "I am looking for Mr. Jedediah," she said, her voice clearer and steadier than she felt. The barkeep wiped a glass with a dirty rag, his movements deliberately slow. "You found him. What's your business?" "My name is Clara Bell. I am the new school teacher. I was told you have the key to my lodging." A low chuckle rippled through the room. One of the men at a nearby table, a burly specimen with a red beard and bloodshot eyes, leaned back in his chair. "A schoolteacher," he drawled, his voice thick with liquor and amusement. "Dry Gulch ain't had a teacher in 5 years. Last one got run off by snakes in his bedroll." His companions laughed, a coarse, ugly sound. "We like things quiet here, ma'am," Jedediah the barkeep said, his tone suggesting he was doing her a favor. "Not much need for book learning." "Nevertheless, I have a contract," Clara insisted, her knuckles white where she gripped her satchel. "Signed by Reverend Thompson. I require the key." The red-bearded man pushed himself to his feet, followed by 2 of his friends. They were unsteady, but their size was menacing as they moved to form a loose semicircle around her, cutting her off from the door. "Well, now," the leader said, a leering smile spreading across his face. "A contract. Sounds mighty official. Maybe you ought to show it to us. We can help you read the fine print." He reached for her satchel. Clara flinched back, pulling it against her chest. "That is not necessary. The key, if you please." "Feisty one, ain't she, boys?" he guffawed, taking another step closer. The smell of cheap whiskey and unwashed sweat rolled off him, making her stomach turn. "I bet she could teach us a thing or two." Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of her composure. The room was closing in. The other men were watching, some with open amusement, others with a detached curiosity. No one was going to help. They were waiting for the show to begin. "Please," she said, her voice losing its firm edge. "Just give me the key." "You want a key? You gotta be nice," the man slurred, his hand darting out to grab her arm. His fingers had barely brushed the fabric of her sleeve when a voice, low and quiet as rolling stones, cut through the tense air. "That's enough." It wasn't loud, it wasn't a shout, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Every man in the room, including the 3 harassing her, froze. They all turned toward the corner booth. The man who had been sitting in shadow was now on his feet. He moved with a liquid grace that was startling, all lethargy gone. He wasn't exceptionally tall or broad, but he held himself with a kind of rooted stillness, as if he were part of the landscape itself. His face was lean and weathered, all sharp angles and planes, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on the man holding Clara's arm. Jonah McGraw didn't look at Clara. He didn't acknowledge her presence at all. His entire focus was on the threat. The red-bearded man, whose name was Bart, slowly released Clara's arm, a flicker of fear replacing the drunken bravado in his eyes. "Now, McGraw," he began, trying for a placating tone. "We was just having a bit of fun, no harm meant." McGraw took one slow step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch the gun on his hip. He didn't need to. "Her business is with the barkeep, not with you. Go sit down." It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, of how things were now going to be. For a long moment, Bart stood his ground, his pride warring with his instinct for self-preservation. The entire saloon held its breath. The quiet was absolute. Then, with a muttered curse, Bart turned and shuffled back to his table, his friends melting away behind him. The spell was broken. Men turned back to their drinks. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Jedediah the barkeep, who had been watching with wide eyes, suddenly became very busy, fumbling under the bar. He produced a large, rusty iron key and slid it across the bar top toward Clara. "Room's out back, first door," he mumbled, refusing to meet her eyes. Clara stood frozen for a second, her heart hammering against her ribs. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving a profound, nauseating weakness in its wake. She reached for the key, her hand shaking so badly she could barely grasp it. Then, she felt a presence beside her. It was McGraw. He had moved so silently she hadn't noticed. He wasn't looking at the barkeep or the other men. He was looking at her. and it was the look that finally undid her. She had been looked at her whole life. Men in New Orleans had looked at her with desire tainted by disdain, assessing her as her mother's daughter. Women had looked at her with pity, a condescension that was just as sharp an insult. The people of Dry Gulch had looked at her with suspicion and contempt. Jonah McGraw's gaze was different. It held no pity. It held no judgment, no appraisal. It was a look of quiet, level assessment. He saw her shaking hands, the pallor of her face, the defiant terror in her eyes. And he simply saw it. He accepted it as fact, like he might accept that the sky was blue or the ground was hard. There was a profound and unsettling fairness in that gaze, a sense that he was seeing her, Clara Bell, not the disgraced daughter or the unwanted outsider, but a person standing in a saloon, trembling after a moment of fear. The simple, unadorned honesty of it shattered the dam of her control. It was more intimate than any touch, more potent than any word of comfort. This stranger, this quiet man with a gun on his hip, had afforded her a dignity no one else had. A single, shuddering breath escaped her lips. The world seemed to tilt, the smoky room wavering at the edges of her vision. She felt a desperate, unfamiliar need to anchor herself, to learn the language of this place, this man, this survival. The words came from a place deeper than thought, a raw, instinctive plea. She whispered, her voice so low it was barely audible above the saloon's renewed murmur. "Teach me slow." It wasn't a request for reading or writing. It was a prayer. Teach me how not to be afraid. Teach me how to stand in this room and not be broken. Teach me how to be seen this way, without the weight of the past. Teach me slowly how to live here. He didn't answer. He just held her gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He took the heavy key from the bar, his calloused fingers brushing hers, and turned toward the back door of the saloon. The command was unspoken, but clear, "Follow me." And for the first time since arriving in Dry Gulch, Clara did not feel entirely alone. She followed him out of the smoky light and into the dying sun of the west. Chapter 3. A small school in the wind and dust. The room behind the saloon was less a lodging and more a punishment. It was a narrow, windowless box that perpetually smelled of stale beer and regret. A thin, lumpy mattress lay on a rickety frame. The single blanket was threadbare, and a washstand with a cracked porcelain basin completed the furnishings. Clara spent the first night sitting upright in the room's only chair, her satchel in her lap, listening to the raucous sounds from the saloon bleed through the thin wall. She did not sleep. She endured. The next morning, she retrieved her trunk. No one offered to help as she dragged the heavy pine box through the dust from the main street to her hovel. The effort left her breathless, her hands raw and splintered. As she unpacked, laying out her few precious books and starched shirtwaists in a room that felt like a tomb, the full weight of her situation settled upon her. Dry Gulch was not a place that would give her anything. Whatever she was to have here, she would have to build from the ground up, with her own 2 hands. Her contract stipulated that the town would provide a schoolhouse. When she inquired at the general store, the hub of the town's grudging commerce and its abundant gossip, the proprietor, a sour-faced woman named Martha Gable, had laughed without humor. "Schoolhouse burned down 2 winters ago," she said, weighing a sack of flour with deliberate slowness. "Council's got no funds for a new one. Figured you'd take one look at this place and be on the next stagecoach out." Her eyes held a challenge, a clear expectation of failure. "The contract is not voided by a lack of funds," Clara stated, keeping her voice even. "It says a building will be provided. Is there no other structure, a barn, a storage shed?" "Mrs." Gable shrugged, gesturing vaguely toward the edge of town. "There's the old freight warehouse. Been empty for years. Roof leaks, floors rotten, and it's full of pack rats. Help yourself." It was a dismissal, meant to be the final word, but to Clara, it was a concession, an opportunity. The warehouse was worse than Mrs., Gable had described. It stood apart from the other buildings, a large, skeletal structure listing slightly to one side, its timbers bleached gray by the sun and scoured by the wind. Half the shingles were missing, and the great double doors hung from broken hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the dust of ages and the sharp scent of animal droppings. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof and walls, painting stripes of light across a floor littered with debris and broken crates. It was perfect. For the next week, Clara Bell waged a one-woman war against the decay. She began before sunrise each day, leaving her suffocating room to pry open the great doors of the warehouse. Using a broken shovel she found in a corner, she scraped years of accumulated filth from the floorboards. She tore down cobwebs thick as cotton batting and dragged splintered crates and barrels out into the unforgiving sun. She found a nest of pack rats and, her stomach churning, drove them out with a long pole, her heart pounding with a primal fear she refused to surrender to. The work was brutal, unlike anything she had ever known. It broke her nails and blistered her hands. Her fine dress was perpetually coated in a layer of grime, and every muscle in her body ached with a deep, exhaustive pain. The town watched. They saw the lone woman wrestling with the derelict building at the edge of their world, and they judged. Wasting her time, she heard a man say on the porch of the general store. Ought to be finding a husband, not sweeping up rat leavings. She's a stubborn one, Mrs. Gable commented to a customer. Prideful, that kind always breaks the hardest. They offered no help, no water, no word of encouragement. Their silence was a form of pressure, a constant, passive force willing her to fail. But with every shovelful of dirt she removed, with every board she hammered back into place with a heavy rock, Clara felt something being scraped clean inside herself as well. The helplessness she had felt in New Orleans, the shame of her family's name, it all seemed to sweat out of her pores and mix with the Texas dust. Here, there was no past. There was only the work. Jonah McGraw she saw only from a distance. He kept to the fringes of the town, his movements quiet and deliberate. Sometimes she would see him leading a string of horses toward the creek, or leaving the blacksmith's forge, a newly shod hoof in his hand. He never looked her way, never acknowledged her presence, but she felt his awareness, a subtle weight in the air, as if he were a hawk circling high overhead, seeing everything without being seen. He was a part of the landscape, as silent and watchful as the mesas on the horizon. By the end of the week, the warehouse was transformed. It was still a rough, cavernous space, but it was clean. Clara had patched the worst of the holes in the walls with salvaged planks. She had scrubbed a wide section of the floor until the wood gleamed faintly. Using overturned crates for desks and a large, flat piece of slate she'd found by the creek bed for a blackboard, she had created the semblance of a classroom. She posted a notice outside the general store, her handwriting neat and clear on a piece of paper from her trunk. School lessons for the children of Dry Gulch, all ages welcome. Reading, writing, arithmetic. Inquire at the old freight warehouse. For 2 days, no one came. The town children, sons and daughters of the storekeeps and the blacksmith, eyed her from a distance but were quickly shooed away by their parents. Clara sat on a crate in her clean, empty schoolhouse, the silence pressing in on her, and felt the first real sting of despair. Then, on the third morning, they appeared. They were not the town children. They came from the opposite direction, from the cluster of tents and crude shacks a mile out, where the men who worked the small silver mine lived with their families. They were the children the town ignored, the ones they called canners or diggers. There were only 4 of them. A boy of about 10, Finn, with a shock of untamed red hair and eyes that were far too old for his face. He held the hand of his younger sister, Elspeth, a wisp of a girl with a solemn face and a tattered dress. Behind them were 2 younger boys, brothers named Caleb and Sam, who clutched each other and looked at Clara as if she were a strange and unpredictable animal. They were all barefoot, their clothes were patched and their faces were smudged with a permanent layer of grime, but their eyes were wide with a desperate, hungry curiosity. The sign said, "For children," Finn said, his voice a rough, uncertain whisper. Clara's heart, which had felt like a stone in her chest, seemed to melt. A smile, the first genuine smile she'd felt in months, touched her lips. "It did," she said softly. "Welcome to school." And so her class began. It was a slow and often frustrating process. The children knew nothing of letters, and holding a piece of chalk was a foreign, clumsy act. They were shy and skittish, unaccustomed to kindness or focused attention, but they were also sponges, soaking up every bit of knowledge she offered. When Elspeth finally managed to write the letter E on her slate, the look of wondrous, triumphant pride on her small face was a greater reward than Clara had ever known. The town's scorn, however, only deepened. Now it was tinged with a new layer of contempt. "Dredging the bottom of the barrel. Is she Mrs.?" Gable remarked loud enough for Clara to hear as she bought a small sack of cornmeal. "Teaching letters to the mining trash. What good will that do them? They're born to the pickaxe, same as their fathers." The sentiment was echoed throughout Dry Gulch. Her school was seen not just as a waste of time, but as an act of foolishness, a pointless stirring of ambition in a class of people who were meant to remain where they were. Her isolation became complete. She was the teacher of the unwanted, and thus she became unwanted herself. One afternoon, a week after the school had started, the sky turned a bruised, ugly purple. The wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the warehouse walls, and a sudden, violent rainstorm broke over the plains. The downpour was a deluge, turning the dust of the street into a thick, running mud. Inside the schoolhouse, the roof, which Clara had known was faulty, revealed the true extent of its decay. Water began to drip, then trickle, then pour through a dozen different places. One stream fell directly onto their precious blackboard, washing away the day's lesson in a river of gray chalk. Clara and the children scrambled to move their slates and the few books she owned, huddling together in the one dry corner of the vast room. The children were frightened. The sound of the rain on the tin sections of the roof a deafening roar. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a dripping, humid world. Clara sent the children home, her heart heavy with defeat. The warehouse was unusable. She had no money for shingles, no skill to fix the roof herself. It felt like the final, insurmountable obstacle. The town, the elements, everything was conspiring to drive her out. She was standing in the middle of the damp, musty room, staring up at the holes in the roof, when a shadow fell across the doorway. It was Jonah McGraw. He stood there for a moment, his broad shoulders filling the frame. He held a hammer in one hand and carried a small canvas sack in the other. He didn't speak. He simply looked at the puddles on the floor. Then his gaze traveled up to the leaking roof. His expression was, as always, unreadable. He stepped inside, his boots making soft sounds on the damp floor. He walked to the corner where the worst leak was, dropped his sack, and pulled out a handful of wooden shingles and a small tin of nails. Without a word to her, he found a sturdy crate, placed it beneath a broken section, and hoisted himself up into the rafters with an easy, athletic grace. Clara watched, stunned into silence. The rhythmic, confident sound of his hammer began to echo through the warehouse. Tap, 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 scrape, tap. He worked with a quiet, focused efficiency, moving from one leak to the next. He was not just patching the holes, he was reinforcing the weak timbers around them. His movements economical and sure. The sun came out, and the light streaming through the gaps in the walls illuminated him as he worked, sweat glistening on his back, the muscles in his arms and shoulders flexing with each hammer blow. He seemed completely absorbed in the task, a man at peace with the simple, tangible act of mending something that was broken. When he was finished, nearly an hour later, he dropped lightly back to the floor, The warehouse was noticeably darker, the streams of sunlight replaced by a more uniform, sheltered gloom. He gathered his tools, his movements unhurried. Clara finally found her voice. I don't know how to thank you, Mr. McGraw. She reached into the small reticule tied at her waist. I don't have much, but I must pay you for the materials, and for your time. She held out a few coins, the last of her carefully hoarded money. He looked at the coins in her palm, then back at her face. He shook his head. A single, small motion. Why? She asked, the word a whisper. Why are you helping me? He paused, his hand on the handle of his hammer. He looked around the clean-swept floor, at the crate desks, at the chalk-smeared slate on the wall. His gaze was not one of judgment or pity. It was simply one of observation. He had seen the problem, and he had fixed it. It was as simple as that. He turned to leave, then stopped in the doorway and looked back at her. No one else would, he said, his voice a low rumble. And then he was gone, his shadow receding into the bright afternoon sun, leaving Clara standing alone in her quiet, dry schoolhouse. Chapter 4. Closeness in Small Things. Jonah McGraw's act of charity, if it could be called that, did not go unnoticed. An act of kindness in Dry Gulch was as rare and suspect as a sudden spring in the desert. It was discussed in low tones over the counter of the general store and dissected over whiskey glasses at the Thirsty Spur. The town, in its collective, cynical wisdom, came to a single conclusion. The quiet, dangerous cowboy had a particular interest in the new schoolteacher, and this conclusion did not endear either of them to the populace. For Clara, the speculation was a fresh layer of frost on the already cold shoulder of the town. The women now looked at her with a new kind of suspicion, their gazes lingering as if searching for a sign of moral failing. The men, who had once been crudely forward, now kept their distance, wary of inviting the silent attention of Jonah McGraw. Her isolation, once a product of her status as an outsider, was now sharpened by her association with him. She and Jonah did not speak of the roof again. There were no words of thanks exchanged after that first fumbling attempt. An unspoken understanding seemed to have settled between them, a recognition that some things were better left to the silence. But the world, once empty of any human connection, now held the quiet possibility of him. His presence was a thread, invisible but strong, woven into the fabric of her days. Their encounters were never planned. They were accidents of routine, small intersections of two solitary lives. A few weeks after the storm, Clara took her small class of children down to the shallow, muddy creek that gave Dry Gulch its name. She intended to teach them about the different kinds of rock and how clay could be formed from the sediment. It was a lesson born of necessity. They had no paper, and she hoped they could fashion their own tablets from the earth. As the children splashed at the water's edge, their laughter a thin, bright sound in the vast quiet, she saw him. He was further upstream, watering his horse, a powerful roan with a watchful eye. He stood with the reins loose in one hand, his posture relaxed but alert. He had seen them. Of course, he saw everything. For a moment, Clara felt a familiar prickle of self-consciousness, wondering what he thought of this strange outdoor classroom. She turned her attention back to the children, showing them how to scoop the thick, wet clay from the bank. Elspeth, the youngest, slipped on a slick rock and tumbled into the water with a surprised cry. It was barely a foot deep, and she was more startled than hurt, but the front of her thin dress was soaked in muddy water. As Clara rushed to help her, a shadow fell over them. Jonah was there, leading his horse. He didn't say a word. He simply offered the end of a thick, dry saddle blanket. Clara took it, her fingers brushing his, and wrapped it around the shivering girl's shoulders. "Thank you," she said quietly. He just nodded, his eyes on the far bank. "Water runs faster after a rain." He said it was not an accusation, just a statement of fact. Best to cross on the low stones. He pointed with his chin to a line of barely submerged rocks that formed a natural, safer path across the stream. He had not just offered help. He had offered knowledge. He led his horse across, his boots finding a sure footing on the slick stones, and disappeared into the scrubby mesquite on the other side. He did not look back. Another time, late in the afternoon, he appeared at the open doors of the warehouse as she was sweeping the floor. The children had gone for the day, and the cavernous space was filled with the long, golden shadows of sunset. He stood silently for a moment, holding his hat in his hands. He was a man who seemed uncomfortable indoors, as if the walls and roof were a cage. "Ma'am," he said, the words sounding slightly formal on his lips. Mr. McGraw," she replied, leaning her broom against a crate. She noticed a long, L-shaped tear in the sleeve of his shirt, from the elbow to the wrist. It was a fresh rip, the edges of the coarse fabric frayed. He followed her gaze, caught it on a nail at the blacksmith's. He held out his arm, not in a plea, but in a simple presentation of a problem. There was a vulnerability in the gesture that tugged at something deep inside her. This man, so self-sufficient and capable, was showing her a weakness. A small bit of damage he could not mend himself. "I can fix that," she said. He nodded, as if he had expected her to say nothing less. He shrugged out of the shirt without a hint of self-consciousness, revealing a plain undershirt and arms corded with lean muscle. He handed the garment to her. The fabric was warm from his body and smelled of sun, dust, and horse. She took it to the crate where she kept her things and retrieved a small sewing kit, a memento from her mother. She sat on another crate, laid the shirt across her lap, and began to work, her needle flashing in the fading light. He did not leave. He stood by the doorway, one shoulder leaned against the frame, and watched the plains darken. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the tiny, rhythmic sounds of her needle pulling the thread through the cloth, the whisper of the wind around the corners of the warehouse, and the distant call of a lone coyote. It was a comfortable silence, a shared space that required no words to fill it. She had spent her life navigating conversations layered with hidden meanings and polite falsehoods. This quiet was honest. It was real. When she finished, the seam was a neat, tight line of stitches, a small mark of order on the worn fabric. She bit the thread and folded the shirt carefully. "There," she said, "it should hold." He came and took it from her, his fingers once again brushing against hers. He looked at the seam, then at her. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes beyond that unnerving, level gaze. It was a flicker of something close to gratitude. Quickly masked. "Obliged," he said, and the single word carried more weight than a flowery speech. He put the shirt back on, buttoned it, and left as quietly as he had arrived. Their closest moment came on an evening when the wind blew hard from the west, a hot, dry gale that picked up the red dust and hazed the sky, making the setting sun look like a blood orange. Clara had stayed late, trying to fashion a new handle for a broken slate. The wind moaned, rattling the timbers of the warehouse and sending fine dust puffing through the cracks in the walls. She was finally packing her things to leave when he rode up, not on his horse, but leading it. He tied the reins to a post and walked toward her. His head ducked against the wind, his hat pulled low. He was carrying something wrapped in a clean cloth. "Long day," he said, his voice raised slightly to be heard over the wind. "The wind makes them feel longer," she replied, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. He nodded and unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a small loaf of bread, still faintly warm. It was a simple, rustic loaf, the kind baked in a camp oven, with a dark, thick crust. He broke it in half with his hands, the sound a satisfying crackle. He offered one half to her. Clara hesitated for only a second before taking it. She was hungry, having forgotten to eat since her small breakfast. They stood there, just outside the shelter of the warehouse, and ate the bread as the red dust swirled around them. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. The crust was chewy, the inside soft and dense. They ate in their customary silence, their gazes turned toward the dramatic, blood-red sunset. The shared, simple act of breaking bread felt more profound than any conversation. It was an acknowledgement of their shared world, a communion in the midst of the harsh, empty landscape. They were two solitary people, finding a moment of reprieve together. When they were finished, Clara brushed the crumbs from her hands. She looked at him, at his strong, quiet profile outlined against the dying light. The question that had been sitting in her heart for weeks finally surfaced. Not the same one as before, but a different one, deeper. "Why do you stay here, Mr. McGraw?" she asked. "In Dry Gulch, it's a hard place." He was silent for a long time, watching the last sliver of the sun disappear below the horizon, leaving the world in a wash of purple and indigo. He crumpled the cloth that had held the bread and tucked it into his pocket. "The world's full of hard places," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "This one, the land is honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything it's not. It doesn't care who your father was or how much money is in your pocket. It asks for your strength, and if you give it, sometimes it gives you a little back." He paused, turning to look at her, and his eyes were dark pools in the twilight. "A man can make a place for himself here, if he's stubborn enough." She understood then. He wasn't talking just about the land. He was talking about a code, a way of living. He stayed because here, a person was measured by their resilience, by their actions, not by the whispers of their past. It was the very thing she had come here seeking. The wind died down as suddenly as it had risen, and the silence that fell was soft and deep. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Thank you for the bread," she said softly. He just nodded. "Good night, ma'am." "Good night, Mr. McGraw." He untied his horse and swung into the saddle, melting into the shadows at the edge of town. Clara stood and watched him go, the taste of fresh bread still on her tongue and the warmth of his quiet company lingering in the cool night air. She knew then that what was growing between them was not a sudden fire. It was something far slower, and perhaps far stronger. It was like the embers of a campfire, buried deep to keep them safe through the long, cold night, glowing quietly in the dark, waiting for the right moment to be fanned back into a flame. Chapter 5. The Dust Storm and the Old Wound. The sky gave the only warning, and it was a subtle one. The brilliant, searing blue of the Texas midday began to fade, not to the gray of clouds, but to a sickly, jaundiced yellow. A strange stillness fell over Dry Gulch, a heavy, breathless pause in the world's rhythm. The air grew thick, and the light took on an eerie, submarine quality. Inside the schoolhouse, Clara felt the change first as a prickling on her skin. She looked up from the slate where she was showing young Elspeth how to form the letters. The 4 children, accustomed to the land's moods in a way she was still learning, had already fallen silent, their eyes wide and fixed on the open warehouse doors. "What is it?" Clara asked, her voice hushed. Finn, the oldest of the mining children, stood and walked to the doorway, sniffing the air like an animal. "Duster," he said, his voice flat with a knowledge that went beyond his years. A bad one, as if summoned by the word. The wind began to rise. It started as a low moan, a mournful sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Then it grew into a relentless, shrieking gale. The first wave of sand and dust hit the warehouse like a charge of buckshot, rattling the loose timbers and finding every crack and seam. Within minutes, the world outside vanished. The yellow light gave way to a suffocating, churning darkness of red-brown dust. Day turned to a terrifying twilight. The sun was gone, erased from the sky. The wind was a physical force, a malevolent presence that slammed against the building, trying to tear it apart. The groans of the old warehouse grew louder. punctuated by the sharp crack of straining wood. Clara gathered the children into the center of the room, away from the walls. They huddled together on a horse blanket she spread on the floor, their small bodies trembling. Elspeth began to cry, a thin, terrified wail that was nearly lost in the roar of the storm. Clara wrapped an arm around her, speaking in a low, soothing voice she didn't feel, telling them a story from one of her books about a brave knight in a dark forest. But her own heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The roof that Jonah had patched was holding, but the entire structure felt as if it were about to be ripped from its foundations. A loud, splintering crack from above made them all jump. A thick film of dust rained down on them. Clara looked up, a massive central beam. The main support for the roof had a jagged, fresh crack running through its center. It was sagging visibly, bowing under the immense pressure of the wind. The building was not going to hold. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. They were trapped. To go outside was to be blinded, choked, and scoured by the storm. To stay inside was to be crushed. For a terrifying moment, her mind went blank. There was no escape. Then, a figure materialized in the doorway, a silhouette against the swirling brown chaos. He was wrapped in a canvas slicker, a bandana pulled high over his nose and mouth, his hat pulled down so low it hid his eyes. But there was no mistaking the set of his shoulders, the quiet authority in his stance. It was Jonah. He moved into the room, pulling the bandana from his face. His eyes, accustomed to the gloom, immediately went to the groaning beam overhead, then to the terrified huddle on the floor. He wasted no time on greetings or explanations. "We have to go," he shouted over the storm. "Now! The whole thing is coming down." He pointed toward the back of the warehouse, to a smaller loading door she had never been able to open. "It leads to the blacksmith's. It's closer, more sheltered. Go." Fear propelled them. Clara grabbed Elspeth's hand, and Finn took charge of the two younger boys. Jonah went to the back door and put his shoulder to it. The old wood groaned in protest. With a surge of strength, he forced it open just enough for them to squeeze through. The world outside was a nightmare. The wind tore at them, trying to rip the breath from their lungs. The air was a thick, gritty soup that blinded them and filled their mouths and noses. Jonah pushed the children ahead of him, shielding them with his own body as they fought their way across the 10 yards of open space to the solid stone wall of the blacksmith's forge. Finn and the younger boys scrambled through the forge's open doorway. Clara was right behind them, practically carrying a terrified Elspeth. As she lunged for the safety of the entrance, she heard a sound that was worse than the wind, a deep, catastrophic crack, the sound of a giant bone snapping. She looked back over her shoulder. The main beam of the warehouse had given way. The whole roof was collapsing inward in a slow-motion cascade of timber and dust. Jonah was still outside, right at the edge of the collapsing structure. He had been ensuring she and Elspeth were clear. He saw her look back, saw the terror in her eyes, and his only reaction was to shove her forward. "Go!" he roared. His shove sent her stumbling into the forge, landing on her hands and knees just as a massive section of the warehouse wall and roof crashed down precisely where they had been standing a second before. The ground shook. A cloud of dust and splintered wood exploded outward. For a moment, all Clara could hear was the ringing in her ears and the undiminished howl of the wind. She scrambled to her feet, her heart frozen. Jonah! He was lying on the ground, just inside the doorway of the forge, half covered in debris. A heavy, splintered roof timber, thick as a man's thigh, lay across his back. Forgetting everything but the sight of him, she rushed to his side. Finn was already there, his small face pale with shock, trying uselessly to push at the beam. "Help me," Clara cried to the boy. Together, they strained against the immense weight. It wouldn't budge. Jonah stirred, groaning, a low sound of pure agony. He pushed himself up with his arms, his face contorted with the effort, trying to help them. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, Clara and Finn heaved again. The timber shifted, just enough for Jonah to roll clear. He collapsed onto the dirt floor of the forge, breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. The storm raged on outside, but inside the dark, cavernous forge, a new, more intimate crisis had begun. The children huddled by the cold hearth, their fear of the storm momentarily replaced by their fear for the man who had saved them. Clara knelt beside him, her hands hovering, unsure of what to do. "Jonah, are you hurt where?" He tried to push himself up, then fell back with a sharp intake of breath. "My shoulder," he rasped, his voice tight with pain. The back of his dark shirt was torn open, and it was wet. In the gloom of the forge, she couldn't tell if it was from rain or something else. "I need to see," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She found the courage to gently tear the ruined fabric of his shirt away from the wound. And then she saw it. A deep, angry gash ran from the top of his shoulder down his back, oozing dark blood. It was a terrible wound, full of splinters and grime from the dirty timber. But it was what lay beneath the new injury that made her breath catch in her throat. Partially obscured by the fresh blood was a scar. It was old, the skin silvery white and puckered around a small, deep indentation, a bullet wound. The sight of it was a shock. A violent piece of his unwritten history laid bare. It spoke of a past filled with the very things she had only read about in dime novels of gunsmoke and blood and life or death struggles. But there was no time for shock. He was bleeding, and the wound needed to be cleaned. A strange, fierce calm descended upon her. The terrified woman from the saloon, the bookish teacher from New Orleans, was gone. In her place was someone she didn't recognize, a woman driven by a single, desperate imperative to help him. "Finn," she said, her voice sharp with authority. "Find me clean water. There must be a barrel somewhere. And rags, anything clean." The boy, grateful for a task, scurried into the depths of the forge. "This will hurt," she whispered to Jonah. She gently began to pick the larger splinters from the gush, her touch as delicate as she could make it. He flinched with each one but never made a sound. His jaw clenched tight. Finn returned with a bucket of rainwater and some cleaner cloths used for polishing metal. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. Clara soaked a cloth and began to clean the wound, washing away the blood and grime. As the fresh injury was cleaned, the old scar beneath became more visible, a pale, ghostly map of a past pain. He was beginning to drift, his body going lax with shock and pain. His breathing was still shallow. She knew she needed to bind the wound tightly. Her own petticoat was her only option. Without a second thought, she ripped a long, wide strip from the hem of the garment, a fine cotton slip she had brought from her old life. As she prepared to wrap his shoulder, his eyes flickered open. They were clouded with pain, his usual guardedness stripped away, leaving behind a raw vulnerability she had never seen. He looked at her, his gaze unfocused, as if seeing something far away. His voice was a mere rasp, a broken whisper that was almost lost in the sound of the wind. "Show me where. Show me where it stops hurting." Her hands stilled. He wasn't talking about the new wound. His glazed eyes were fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, his body remembering a pain that had nothing to do with a falling beam. He was asking about the bullet hole, about the fight that caused it, about a hurt that had settled deep in his bones and never truly left. For a long moment, she looked at his face, at the lines of pain etched there, at the stark vulnerability that he would surely hide the moment his strength returned. He had saved her life. He had saved the children. He had stood between them and the crushing weight of the world. And he had broken. Slowly, tenderly. She reached out her hand. She did not touch the fresh, bleeding gash. Instead, she laid her palm flat against his back, her fingers gently covering the old, silvery scar. Her touch was not that of a nurse, but something else entirely. It was a touch of acceptance, of acknowledgement, a silent answer to a question he hadn't truly meant to ask. She felt a tremor run through him at her touch, a deep, shuddering sigh that was half groan, half release. He didn't speak again, his eyes drifting closed, but they both knew. She was touching the source of the pain, the real wound that had never healed, and in the heart of the raging storm, surrounded by darkness and fear, she was not afraid. She held her hand there, a small point of warmth against the cold, hard passed, and waited for the wind to die. Chapter 6. The Enemy from the Shadows. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving behind a world scoured clean and unnervingly quiet. The sun rose into a sky of pale, washed-out blue, illuminating the full scope of the devastation. Dry Gulch looked like a child's model town kicked over by a petulant giant. Porches were stripped of their awnings, windows were shattered, and a thick carpet of red sand covered everything, smoothing the hard edges of the world into soft, sorrowful dunes. The warehouse, Clara's school, was a skeleton. The walls had collapsed into a tangled heap of splintered timbers, and the roof lay caved in upon itself. Her books, her slates, her small, hard-won world of learning were buried under the wreckage. Inside the blacksmith's forge, the air was still and close, smelling of coal dust, rain-dampened earth, and the faint, metallic scent of blood. Clara had not slept. She had spent the night watching over Jonah, who drifted in a feverish, pain-filled sleep. She kept a cool, wet cloth on his forehead and changed the dressing on his shoulder twice, her movements deft and practiced now, born of a desperate necessity. In the pale morning light, his face looked younger, the harsh lines softened by unconsciousness. The vulnerability she had glimpsed when he was in pain was now fully present, and it stirred a fierce, protective instinct in her she had never known. As the town began to stir, with the sounds of hammers and men's voices shouting instructions, a new sound joined the chorus, the confident, rhythmic hoofbeats of a well-bred horse. Clara glanced through the open forge door. A man was riding down the main street, and he was unlike anyone she had seen in Dry Gulch. He sat tall in a polished leather saddle, wearing a fine wool coat despite the growing heat, and his boots shone with a luster that seemed impossible in this dusty world. He was handsome in a severe, clean-shaven way, with cold blue eyes that missed nothing. He surveyed the damage not with sympathy, but with the cool, calculating appraisal of a man tallying accounts. He dismounted in front of the general store and spoke to Mrs. Gable's husband, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. It was a voice of command, accustomed to being obeyed. This, Clara knew instinctively, was a man of power. Later that day, when she left a sleeping Jonah to fetch more water and supplies, she learned his name. "That's Elias Boone," Mrs. Gable told her, her tone a mixture of reverence and fear. "Owns the Circle B Ranch, biggest spread in this whole territory. He practically owns this town, too." Clara watched through the store window as Boone directed a group of his ranch hands who were clearing a fallen water tower from the street. He did not raise his voice. He simply pointed, and men scrambled to do his bidding. "Heard he's looking to expand his corrals," Mrs. Gable continued, her eyes alight with the thrill of important gossip. "Told my Henry he'd make the council a fair offer for the old warehouse lot. Says he'll clear the rubble himself. A real civic gesture, he called it." Clara's blood went cold. The warehouse lot? Her school? Before she could even begin to think of rebuilding, the land was being sold out from under her. "But the council gave me the use of it," Clara said, her voice small. "Mrs. Gable gave a short, dismissive laugh. "That was a charity case. Dearie, this is business. Elias Boone gets what he wants." The woman's eyes then flickered with something else, a sly, knowing look. She glanced in the direction of the blacksmith's forge. "Besides, with the company you're keeping, you might not be staying long anyway." The implication was clear. Her association with Jonah McGraw had marked her as definitively as a brand on cattle. When she returned to the forge, Jonah was awake. He was sitting up, his back resting against an anvil, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes clear. The fever had broken. He watched her as she set down the bucket of water. "You should have let me be," he said, his voice a rough rasp. "And you should have let the roof fall on me," she countered gently. "I believe that makes us even." A faint ghost of a smile touched his lips before vanishing. He looked down at his bandaged shoulder, then back at her. "You've got a steady hand. My mother taught me needlepoint. It seems the skills are transferable." She soaked a fresh cloth and began to clean the grime from his face. He endured her touch, his usual guardedness tempered by his weakness. "Elias Boone is in town," she said, her voice carefully neutral. His body went still. It was an almost imperceptible change, but the air around him suddenly felt colder. His eyes, when they met hers, were hard as flint. "What's his business?" "He wants the warehouse land. He plans to build a stable." Jonah was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. The muscles in his jaw tightened. He always did have a taste for what ain't his. The way he said it confirmed what she had begun to suspect. "You know him." "We've met," he said, and the words were clipped, final. He would say no more. But Clara saw the way his hand unconsciously drifted toward his injured shoulder, toward the old, white scar that lay beneath her bandage. And she understood. The scar had a name, and its name was Boone. 2 days later, Jonah was strong enough to walk, though he moved stiffly, his arm in a sling she had fashioned. He refused to stay in the forge any longer, retreating to the small, solitary cabin he had on a parcel of land at the edge of town. Clara was left with the ruins of her school and the encroaching shadow of Elias Boone. Boone made his move that afternoon. Clara had gone back to the wreckage, a hopeless task, trying to see if any of the children's slates or her few books could be salvaged. She was kneeling in the debris, pulling a splintered piece of her blackboard from the rubble, when his shadow fell over her. "Miss Bell," he said. His voice was smooth, like whiskey poured over ice. She stood slowly, brushing the dust from her hands and dress, and turned to face him. Up close, his presence was even more formidable. He was a man who radiated an aura of wealth and absolute self-assurance. "Mr. Boone," she replied, her tone polite but cool. "A terrible tragedy. This storm," he said, gesturing at the wreckage. "A great loss for the community. You showed remarkable spirit, trying to build something from this ruin." His words were complimentary, but his eyes were not. They were assessing her, cataloging her patched dress, her calloused hands, her determined but weary expression. It was the gaze of a man evaluating livestock. "I had help from the children," she said simply. "Ah, yes, the miners' children," he said, a faint, dismissive smile on his lips. "A noble, if perhaps futile, endeavor. A woman of your refinement, your education. You are wasted here. Miss Bell, utterly wasted." He took a step closer. His proximity was an invasion, a deliberate claiming of the space around her. "Dry Gulch is a rough town, fit for rough men, not for a lady. You deserve a respectable position, a safe home, proper wages, the company of civilized people." Clara's spine stiffened. "And I suppose you are here to offer me such a position?" His smile widened. "You are as perceptive as I'd heard. I am in need of a governess for my foreman's children. Out at the Circle B, the work would be light. You would have your own comfortable quarters, a generous salary. You would want for nothing." It was the gilded cage, just as she had imagined, an escape from the dust and the poverty and the scorn of the town. It was everything a woman in her position was supposed to want. "And the school," she asked, "this land." "The council has accepted my offer to purchase and clear this lot," he said smoothly. "It is a matter of public improvement. I'm sure you understand." "I understand that you are taking my school to build a stable for your horses," she said, her voice level. For the first time, a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He had expected gratitude, perhaps a tearful acceptance. He had not expected opposition. "I am offering you a lifeline, Miss Bell," he said, his voice losing some of its silken charm, replaced by a harder edge. "You should take it. An association with a man like Jonah McGraw will bring you nothing but grief. He is a relic, a man with a past full of violence and trouble. He has no name, no money, no future. He will drag you down into the dust with him." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I know him of old. The man is a walking ghost. Leave him to his haunting. Come with me. I can give you a decent life. He can only give you his troubles." The offer hung in the air between them, ugly and clear. It was not a job he was offering. It was a trade, her loyalty for her security, her soul for a comfortable room. He wanted to buy her, to peel her away from Jonah, to isolate his old enemy completely. The school, her dream, was just a casualty. The true target was McGraw. Clara looked from Boone's handsome, cruel face to the wreckage of her school around them. She thought of Finn and Elspeth and their hungry eyes. She thought of Jonah, his quiet acts of kindness, the shared bread in the red dusk. She thought of his pain-filled whisper in the dark forge and her hand covering his old scar. That was a world of hardship. Yes, but it was a world of truth. What Boone offered was a lie, wrapped in comfort. She met his cold blue eyes without flinching. "Thank you for your offer, Mr. Boone," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But I am a school teacher. My place is here, with my students. As for Mr. McGraw, his troubles are his own, and I am not for sale." A dark flush rose on Elias Boone's neck. His charming facade crumbled, revealing the raw arrogance beneath. His eyes narrowed into icy slits. "You are making a mistake, Miss Bell," he said, his voice low and menacing. "A very foolish mistake. You will find that this town has little patience for foolish women, and I have even less." He turned on his heel and strode away, leaving her standing alone in the ruins, the weight of his threat settling upon her like the dust. The lines were drawn. She had chosen her side, and she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that the storm that had passed was nothing compared to the one that was to come. Chapter 7. The Fire Beneath the Chapel Roof. Reverend Thompson returned to Dry Gulch a week after the storm, a small, bird-like man with a kind face weathered by years of riding the circuit. He found his town battered but not broken, and his church spared the worst of the wind. Standing as a lone beacon of hope, he declared that the following Sunday service would be a day of thanksgiving and recommitment to the community's future. For Clara, the announcement presented a dilemma. The church represented the very community that had ostracized her. To attend felt like an act of supplication to a people who had shown her nothing but scorn. To stay away felt like admitting defeat, like accepting her status as an outcast who had no place in their house of worship. She was sorting through the pitifully small pile of salvaged slates near the ruins of her school when Jonah appeared. He moved with a slight stiffness, his left arm no longer in a sling but held carefully at his side. He didn't offer a greeting, but stood for a moment, watching her wipe the red dust from a cracked piece of slate. "The Reverend came by my cabin," he said, his voice quiet. "Said all are welcome at the service." It was not a question, but she heard the inquiry behind it. He was asking what she intended to do. He was, in his own way, asking what they intended to do, since the storm. The unspoken bond between them had solidified. He had brought her food from his own small stores, and she had continued to check his wound, her touch now familiar and professional. They were allies, bound by a shared crisis, but they had not yet tested that alliance in the public square. Clara looked up from the slate, her gaze meeting his. In his eyes, she saw the same question she felt in her own heart. Were they to continue as two separate islands of solitude, or would they stand on the same shore? "I believe," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. that I have as much right to give thanks as anyone in this town." A slow nod was his only reply. "I'll walk with you." And so, on Sunday morning, the town of Dry Gulch received its second great shock in as many weeks. The first had been the storm. The second was the sight of Clara Bell, the disgraced schoolteacher, walking toward the church side by side with Jonah McGraw, the quiet gunslinger. They did not touch, they did not speak. A respectable distance of a foot or so separated them, but they moved in unison, their steps falling into the same rhythm. They were a unit. As they ascended the 3 wooden steps to the church entrance, a wave of silence rippled through the congregation gathered outside. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. The air grew thick with whispers and hard, speculative stares. They walked down the central aisle, the sound of their boots echoing on the pine floorboards. Every eye in the room followed them. Clara kept her chin held high, her gaze fixed on the simple cross at the front of the church, but she could feel the heat of the judgment on her skin. She was acutely aware of Jonah beside her, a solid, reassuring presence. He seemed oblivious to the stares, his face as impassive as carved stone, but she could sense the tension in the set of his shoulders. They chose a pew midway back as they sat on the hard, polished wood. The whispers in the church swelled before being quelled by the appearance of Reverend Thompson at the pulpit. The service began. The Reverend spoke of resilience, of community, of the bonds that held a town together in the face of adversity. He spoke of charity and forgiveness. His words were a balm, but they fell on a congregation that was simmering with a different kind of spirit. The air remained tense, charged with an unholy curiosity. In the front pew, like a king in his court, sat Elias Boone. He was immaculately dressed, his posture radiating an easy authority. He had made a generous donation to the church's repair fund, an act the Reverend had praised publicly at the start of the service. Boone had acknowledged the praise with a magnanimous nod, his gaze sweeping over the pews, pausing for a fraction of a second, with cold amusement, on Clara and Jonah, and as the Reverend finished his sermon and prepared to lead the final hymn, Boone rose to his feet. "Reverend," he said, his smooth, commanding voice filling the sanctuary, "if I may have a word, as a concerned member of this community." Reverend Thompson, taken by surprise, hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course, Mr. Boone." Boone did not address the Reverend. Instead, he turned to face the congregation, his stance that of a politician addressing his constituents. "The Reverend speaks of rebuilding," Boone began, his tone reasonable, paternal, "and I agree. We must rebuild not just our structures, but the very moral foundation of our town. We must be vigilant against elements that might weaken that foundation, elements that bring with them a history, a shadow, that has no place among decent, God-fearing folk." A nervous hush fell over the church. Every person knew exactly where this was heading. Clara felt her blood run cold. Beside her, Jonah did not move, but she felt him draw into himself, a stillness so profound it was like the moment before a lightning strike. Boone's gaze found Clara and fixed on her, a predator singling out its prey. "We have a woman in our midst who has taken it upon herself to educate our children," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "A noble calling, but one that requires a character beyond reproach. And I ask myself, I ask all of you, what do we truly know of this Miss Bell?" He let the question hang in the air. Clara could feel dozens of pairs of eyes boring into her. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the wood of the pew. "I have taken the liberty of making some inquiries," Boone went on, his voice taking on a sharp, cruel edge. "It seems our school teacher comes to us from New Orleans, a city of many charms, but also many temptations. She comes from a family whose name is not spoken in polite society, a name associated with gambling dens and saloon singers, and a reputation that would make a good woman blush." A collective gasp went through the room. It was one thing to whisper and suspect. It was another to have it laid bare in the house of God. Mrs. Gable looked at her neighbor with an expression of smug vindication. "And now she appears in our church," Boone's voice rose, filled with righteous indignation, "on the arm of a man whose only reputation was earned with the gun on his hip, a man whose past is stained with gunpowder and blood. I ask you, is this the moral example we want for our children? A woman of ill repute and a hired gun." He had done it, with a few well-chosen words. He had taken her past and Jonah's and twisted them into a single, ugly weapon. He had painted them as a contagion, a threat to the town's very soul. Clara felt as though the air had been forced from her lungs. The shame she had carried her entire life washed over her, hot and suffocating. She could feel Jonah beside her, a coiled spring of silent, lethal fury. She knew he could end this. A single word, a single step toward Boone, and the confrontation would turn violent. But violence would only prove Boone right. It would only confirm everything he had said about the man of blood and the woman of shame. And then, something inside her snapped. It was not the fragile pride of a New Orleans lady. It was the hard, forged resilience of a woman who had scraped a school out of a rat-infested warehouse, who had faced down a dust storm, who had cleaned a man's wound with a strip of her own petticoat. She would not be broken. Not here, not by him. Slowly, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and rage, Clara Bell rose to her feet. A new wave of whispers swept the church. Jonah looked at her, his eyes blazing, a silent question in their depths. She gave the slightest shake of her head. "No, not your fight, mine." She faced Elias Boone, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but carried to every corner of the silent church. "You are correct, Mr. Boone," she began, and the room held its breath. "I do come from New Orleans, and you are correct that my family's name is not a proud one. I have spent my life living in the shadow of my parents' mistakes, a shadow I did not create, but one I was forced to endure." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the townspeople, the Gables, the blacksmith, the men from the saloon. "I came to Dry Gulch seeking not to hide my past, but to build a future based not on my name, but on my actions. The only thing I have done in this town is try to teach children who had no one else to teach them. I have asked for nothing but the chance to do my work." She turned her eyes back to Boone, and all the fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear fire. "You speak of moral foundations. Is the foundation of this town built on judging a person for the sins of their father? Is it built on shaming a woman who has done you no harm? Or is it built on giving a person a chance to prove their worth? You speak of my association with Mr. McGraw. The only thing this man has ever done for me is show me kindness when no one else would. He protected me. He saved my life, and the lives of my students. If that is the company of a sinner, then I will gladly keep it." She had said her piece. She stood alone, exposed, her heart hammering. She expected to be shouted down, to be cast out. And then she felt it. Beneath the pew, out of sight of the prying eyes, Jonah's hand found hers. It was not a tentative touch. His calloused, strong fingers closed around her own. His grip firm, solid, and utterly unequivocal. It was an anchor in the storm of their stares. It was a silent oath. His thumb moved in a slow, reassuring circle over her knuckles. The strength that flowed from his hand into hers was a tangible thing. It quieted the trembling in her limbs and steadied the frantic beating of her heart. She was not alone. In this room full of enemies and silent judges, she was not alone. The whole town might be against them, but in that moment, their shared space on the hard wooden pew was the only ground that mattered. Clara slowly sat down, her hand still held fast in his. Elias Boone was momentarily speechless, his attack thwarted not by violence, but by a quiet dignity he could not comprehend. His face was a mask of thunderous fury. He opened his mouth to speak again, but Reverend Thompson, finding his voice at last, stepped forward. "That is enough, Mr. Boone," the Reverend said, his tone firm. "This is a house of God, not a courtroom. We will have no more of it." Boone shot one last look of pure venom at Clara and Jonah before sitting down abruptly. The service concluded in a strained, awkward silence. When the final prayer was said, Clara and Jonah rose as one. They walked back down the aisle, their hands now separated, but the space between them no longer felt like a distance. It felt charged, a connection visible to all. The townspeople did not whisper. They stared, their expressions a mixture of shock, confusion, and, for the first time, a grudging, uncertain respect. They parted to let them pass, as if making way for a force they did not understand. They stepped out of the church and into the bright, unforgiving sunlight, leaving the shadows and the whispers behind them. For the first time, the entire town of Dry Gulch had seen them stand together, and they both knew that nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 8. Gunfire in Dry Gulch. The confrontation in the church broke something in Dry Gulch. The town's quiet, simmering hostility toward its two outcasts had been lanced, and in its place grew something more dangerous, a tense, watchful silence. The air was thick with the certainty that Elias Boone, a man whose pride was as vast as his land holdings, would not let such a public humiliation stand. He had been defied, and in his world, defiance was a debt that could only be paid in pain. The days that followed were heavy with a suffocating, unspoken dread. Boone's ranch hands, the Circle B boys, began to appear in town with increasing frequency. They were hard, swaggering men with cruel eyes, and they moved with the proprietary air of an occupying army. Their target was Jonah. They did not challenge him directly at first. Their methods were a campaign of small, pointed aggressions, designed to provoke him into the violence that would prove Boone's accusations correct. They would block his path on the boardwalk, forcing him to step into the dusty street. They would gather at the saloon, their voices loud as they told crude jokes about proud women and the quiet men who hid behind them. One afternoon, as Jonah was leaving the blacksmith's, one of Boone's men deliberately spooked his horse, forcing Jonah to spend 10 minutes calming the frightened animal, while the men watched and laughed from the saloon porch. Through it all, Jonah remained a monument of self-control. He met their provocations with a flat, unnerving stillness. He would step into the street without a word. He would ignore their jeers. He would calm his horse with a quiet, steady hand. His refusal to be baited was a form of defiance more infuriating to Boone's men than any angry retort. They were trying to start a fire, but Jonah offered them no tinder. Clara watched all of this with a heart full of helpless fear. She had resumed her classes, holding them in the open air on the sheltered side of the ruined warehouse. The children, loyal in their own quiet way, still came every morning, but she was always aware of the tension coiling in the town. She saw the Circle B men watching her, their leering smiles making her skin crawl, and she saw Jonah, moving through the town with a preternatural awareness, his hand never far from the Colt at his hip. The quiet peace they had found in their small, shared moments had been shattered, replaced by the constant, grinding threat of violence. She knew he was doing it for her. His restraint was a shield, meant to protect her from the consequences of his reputation. He was trying to be the man she believed him to be, not the gunman Boone had painted him as, and she feared that the effort would cost him his life. The breaking point came on a hot, moonless night a week after the Sunday service. A thick, oppressive heat clung to the town, refusing to dissipate with the setting of the sun. Clara was in her small room behind the saloon, unable to sleep, the sounds from the thirsty spur louder and more aggressive than usual. She could hear the voices of Boone's men, thick with whiskey and malice. A sudden, sharp crash from the street, followed by a roar of laughter, sent a jolt of alarm through her. Peeking through a crack in her shutters, she saw them. Elias Boone was there, flanked by 4 of his best men, They had overturned the town's main water trough, sending a torrent of precious water flooding into the dust. They were drunk, and they were looking for a fight. And then she saw Jonah. He was walking from the direction of the livery stable, his steps unhurried. He had clearly intended to bypass the saloon, to give the men a wide berth. But they had seen him. They moved to block his path, fanning out across the street, their bodies silhouetted against the lamplight spilling from the saloon. "Well, look here, boys." Boone's voice, slurred but venomous, cut through the night. "It's the town hero, the gunslinger with the fancy woman." Jonah stopped. He did not speak. His body was still, but it was the stillness of a coiled snake. "I hear your little teacher is holding class out in the dirt now," Boone sneered. "Like the animal she is. Maybe you ought to teach her some new tricks. McGraw, the kind her mother was famous for." That was the line. It was not a challenge to Jonah's strength or his past, but a vile stain cast upon Clara's honor. It was the one thing he would not endure. Clara saw the almost imperceptible shift in his posture, the slight drop of his right shoulder. It was the only warning. "Boone." Jonah's voice was unnaturally calm, a low rumble of thunder before the storm. "You've had your say. Now get out of my way." Or what Boone laughed, pulling his own pistol, a fancy, silver-inlaid revolver. His men followed suit, their hands dropping to their holsters. "You'll shoot me 5 against 1. I like those odds." What happened next was a blur of speed and terrifying noise that seemed to rip the night apart. Clara's mind could not process it in sequence, only in brilliant, terrible flashes. Jonah's hand did not seem to move. The Colt was simply in it, spitting fire. The sound was a deafening crack. One of Boone's men cried out and fell, clutching his leg, before the man even hit the ground. Jonah's gun had fired again. A second man staggered back, his gun arm hanging useless at his side. He was faster than she could have imagined, faster than seemed humanly possible. But he was still only one man. As he fired his second shot, Boone and the other 2 opened fire. The street exploded in a chaotic volley of muzzle flashes and the whine of ricocheting bullets. Clara screamed, her voice swallowed by the cacophony. Jonah twisted, firing a third time, and another of Boone's men went down. But in that same instant, she saw him jerk violently, his body arching back as if struck by an invisible fist. A dark stain blossomed on his side, high on his ribs. He stumbled but did not fall, bringing his gun around to bear on Boone. Boone, his face a mask of drunken rage and shock at the swiftness of the assault, fired again. The bullet struck Jonah in the gut. This time, he went down, falling to one knee, his gun slipping from his grasp. The silence that followed was as shocking as the noise had been. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. For a moment, no one moved. Boone stood over the kneeling form of his rival, his pistol smoking, his chest heaving. One of his men, still standing, looked from Jonah to his employer, his face pale in the moonlight. "Let's go, boss," the man urged, his voice shaking. "Let's get out of here." Boone stared at Jonah for a second longer, a look of grim, unsatisfying victory on his face. Then, without another word, he turned and, with his remaining man helping the wounded, they mounted their horses and galloped out of town, leaving their carnage behind them. The street was empty, save for the still form of Jonah McGraw, who had now collapsed completely into the dust. For a heartbeat, Clara was frozen, paralyzed by horror. Then, a force stronger than fear took hold of her. She threw open her door and ran. She did not think about her own safety. She did not think about the townspeople who were now peering from their windows. She saw only him. She fell to her knees beside him, her dress instantly soaking up the dust and something warm and wet. "Jonah," she whispered, her hands hovering over him. "Jonah, can you hear me?" He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. They were clouded with a pain so immense it stole her breath. "Clara," he breathed, his voice a faint, bubbling whisper. A trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. He was dying. The thought was a shard of ice in her heart. No, she would not let him. "You have to get up," she said, her voice a raw, desperate plea. "I can't carry you. You have to help me." She hooked her arms under his, trying to lift him. He was a dead weight, his body limp and unresponsive. But as she pulled, fueled by a strength she did not know she possessed, he seemed to understand. He made a sound, a deep, guttural noise of agony, and tried to push with his legs. It was a nightmare journey of inches. She dragged him, half carrying him, his boots leaving 2 long, dark trails in the dusty street. The town watched in silence. No one came out, no door opened. No one offered to help. They were alone. Her destination was the only place she could think of, the only place that had ever felt like theirs. Not her suffocating room, not his solitary cabin. She dragged him toward the ruins of the warehouse, their sanctuary. The effort was titanic. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her lungs burned. By the time she reached the wreckage, she was sobbing with exertion and terror. She managed to pull him into the partial shelter of a section of wall that was still standing, collapsing beside him, her body shaking uncontrollably. The moon broke through the clouds, its pale light illuminating the scene. Jonah lay on the ground, his breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. The front of his shirt was a mass of dark, spreading blood. His face was waxy and still. His life was draining out of him into the dry Texas earth. Clara looked at his still form, at the dark ruins around them, at the silent, watching town behind her. She was alone, with a dying man and a night that felt like it would never end. She had pulled him from the fire, but now, in the ashes of their small world, she had to find a way to keep him from being consumed by the dark. Chapter 9. Truth and Choice. The world shrank to the small, desperate circle of ground where Jonah lay bleeding. The silent town. The vast, star-dusted sky. The howl of a distant coyote, all of it faded into a dull, meaningless backdrop. All that existed was the man on the ground and the frantic, inadequate work of her own 2 hands. Clara tore at her dress with a fury she didn't know she possessed. The fabric of her skirt, her last decent garment, became her bandages. She ripped it into long, desperate strips, her fingers clumsy and slick with his blood. There were 2 wounds. The one on his side was a deep, ugly tear, but the bleeding, while steady, seemed manageable. It was the other one, low in his gut, that filled her with a cold, bottomless dread. It wept blood in a slow, constant seep that seemed to be draining the very life from him. "Stay with me, Jonah," she whispered, her voice a raw, ragged thing. She balled up a thick wad of cloth and pressed it hard against the gut wound, leaning into it with all her weight. "You cannot leave. Do you hear me? You are not allowed to leave." He was barely conscious, a man adrift on a dark, painful tide. His breath was a shallow catch in his chest, his skin clammy and cool to the touch despite the night's heat. At times, his eyes would flicker open, but they were unfocused, looking at something she couldn't see. He would murmur broken words, fragments of a life lived in shadow. Rusted spur, cold river. Should have been faster. They were the ghosts of his past, rising to haunt him at the threshold of death. She worked in a desperate, focused frenzy. She bound the wound on his side as tightly as she could, the strip of cloth a stark white against his blood-soaked shirt. But the wound in his belly was another matter. Pressure was all she had, a losing battle against an enemy she could not see. She held the makeshift compress in place, her arms trembling with strain, her own body a shield against the finality of death. The hours bled into one another. The moon climbed higher, casting long, skeletal shadows from the ruined timbers of their schoolhouse. The place that had been their sanctuary was now a tomb, a makeshift field hospital where she was the only doctor, armed with nothing but cloth and a desperate will. Talk to me. Jonah, she pleaded, her voice cracking. Don't go quiet. Tell me. Tell me about the sky and the mountains. Tell me the name of your horse. She needed the sound of his voice, any sound, to prove he was still with her. For a long time, there was only the sound of his ragged breathing. Then, his eyes opened. This time, they were clear. The delirium had passed, leaving behind a terrifying, lucid pain. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw the entirety of his fight, his exhaustion, his surrender. Clara, he whispered, the name, a faint puff of air. His hand, shaking with a terrible weakness, came up and touched her arm where she pressed down on his wound. His touch was cold. I'm here, she said. Tears she hadn't realized she was crying now streaming down her face. I'm not going anywhere. He gave a small, weak shake of his head. A grimace of pain twisted his features. Doesn't matter. It does matter. It's the only thing that matters, she cried, her voice fierce. He was quiet for a moment, gathering what little strength he had left. His gaze moved from her face to the wreckage around them, then up to the indifferent stars. When he spoke again, his voice was a ghost of its former self, stripped bare of all its defenses, all its quiet strength. It was the sound of a man's soul laid open. I ain't afraid of bullets. Clara, he whispered. The confession was so quiet she had to lean closer to hear it, her ear just inches from his lips. Never have been. Bullets are honest. They do what they're meant to do. He took a shuddering breath, a sound that was more blood than air. I'm afraid of belonging to no one. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. They were the key that unlocked everything about him. His solitude, his silence, his reluctance to accept kindness. It was never about a dark past or a love of violence. It was about a wound far deeper than the one his old scar marked, a wound that no bullet had ever made. It was the ache of a man who had walked through the world utterly alone, convinced that there was no place for him, no one to claim him, no one to mourn him when he was gone. In that moment, she did not see a gunman. She saw a lonely boy who had grown into a lonely man, using a shell of hardness to protect a heart terrified of its own emptiness. And she understood him completely, because his fear was her fear. She had run from New Orleans, from the shame of a name that had left her belonging to no one. She had come to Dry Gulch seeking a place, a community, a life where she could put down roots. She had been searching for a home. She looked at the dying man before her, a man the world had thrown away, and she realized she had been searching in all the wrong places. Home was not a building. It was not a town. It was this, it was here, it was him. All the fear and shame that had governed her life fell away, burned to ash by the raw truth of his confession. She had spent her life being told she was not good enough. Now, for the first time, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly what was needed. She leaned down, her face close to his, her tears falling onto his pale cheek. Her voice was no longer pleading or desperate. It was a vow, soft and unbreakable, spoken in the ruins of their world. Then belong to me, she whispered. His eyes, clouded with pain, widened slightly, focusing on her with a desperate intensity. He had offered her his deepest truth, and she was meeting it with her own. She took his cold hand in both of hers, pressing it to her cheek. She thought of their first real conversation in the smoky saloon, her terrified plea and his silent assent. The world had turned since then. They had both turned. Now it was her turn to make the promise. I'll teach you slow. It was the echo of her own request, now transformed into a sacred promise. I will teach you, slowly, how to be loved. I will teach you, slowly, how to have a place. I will teach you, slowly, that you are not alone. It was an answer to the question his soul had been asking his entire life. A single tear escaped the corner of his eye and traced a clean path through the grime on his temple. A shudder ran through his body, a release of a tension he had held for a lifetime. He did not have the strength to speak. But she saw the answer in his eyes. He squeezed her hand, a flicker of pressure, a final, desperate act of holding on. Then his eyes drifted closed, and his body went limp, his head lolling to the side. For one terrible, heart-stopping moment, she thought he was gone. She pressed her fingers to his neck, praying, and then she felt it, faint and thready. But there, a pulse. He was alive. He had heard her. He had chosen to hold on. Clara did not move. She kept her weight on his wound, her other hand holding his, her promise hanging in the cool night air. She had claimed him, and now she would spend the rest of the night and the rest of her life, if she had to, fighting to keep what was hers. The battle had just begun, but in the heart of the deepest darkness, she had found her truth, and she would not let it go. Chapter 10. Dawn on the Red Sand. Dawn broke not with a gentle blush, but with a sharp, unforgiving line of light drawn across the eastern horizon. The red earth seemed to drink in the color, glowing with a fierce, bloody intensity. In the ruins of the schoolhouse, the light found Clara, her back pressed against a section of standing wall, her body a shield for the man who lay beside her. She had not moved all night, save to check his pulse and adjust the makeshift bandages. She was an exhausted, grime-streaked statue of pure, unyielding will. Jonah was alive. His life was a flickering candle flame in a high wind, but it had not gone out. The first person to approach was not a townsman, but a child, young Finn, his face pale and smudged with tears, appeared at the edge of the wreckage, carrying a tin bucket of water. He had seen the gunfight from the small shack he called home, and his first thought had been for his teacher. He stopped short at the sight of Jonah's still form and the dark, stiff patches in the dust.
"Is he?"
the boy whispered, his voice trembling.
"He is alive,"
Clara said, her own voice a dry crackle.
"but he needs a doctor."
Dry Gulch had no doctor. The closest was a 2-day ride away. The boy's face fell, but then his gaze hardened with a resolve that mirrored her own. He set down the water and ran, not back to the miners' camp, but toward the center of town, toward the church. The town was stirring, its people emerging to survey the aftermath of the night's violence. They saw the blood in the street, the discarded bullet casings glinting in the morning sun. They saw the closed doors of the saloon and the conspicuous absence of Elias Boone and his men. And then they saw the small boy, running as if the devil were on his heels, straight to the parsonage door. A few moments later, Reverend Thompson emerged, his face a mask of grim concern. He walked with Finn to the ruins, his steps quickening when he saw the scene. He knelt beside Clara, his gentle eyes taking in Jonah's waxy pallor, the crude, blood-soaked bandages, and the woman's exhausted, defiant face.
"Dear Lord,"
he breathed. He placed a hand on Jonah's forehead. "He's burning with fever." "Boone did this," Clara said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He and his men, they forced him to it." The Reverend looked from her to the silent, watching faces that had begun to gather at a distance, the Gables, the blacksmith, a dozen others. Their expressions were no longer scornful, but a mixture of fear, shock, and a dawning, terrible shame. They had stood by. They had watched. They had done nothing. The silence was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Elias Boone, flanked by his 2 remaining able-bodied men, rode back into town. He looked rested. His clothes were clean, and a smirk of satisfaction played on his lips. He had come to survey his victory, to see the body of his enemy and the final breaking of the woman who had defied him. He clearly expected to find Jonah dead and Clara either gone or begging for the mercy he had offered. He reined in his horse when he saw the gathering at the warehouse. His smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then annoyance. "Reverend," Boone called out, his voice booming with false authority. "I see the town's trash has been taken out. I trust you will see to a swift burial." The man was a menace. Reverend Thompson rose slowly to his feet. The small, mild-mannered man seemed to grow in stature, his face set with a cold, righteous anger that no one in Dry Gulch had ever seen. "The only menace I see here, Mr. Boone, is a man who brings violence and corruption to a town, and then calls it justice," the Reverend said, his voice clear and ringing. "Last night, you did not face a gunman. You and 4 of your men ambushed a single man who was defending a woman's honor. You did it in the dark, like a coward." Boone's face flushed a dark, mottled red. "That man was a killer. I was defending the town's decency." "Were you?" It was another voice, rough and heavy. The blacksmith, a large, powerful man named Angus, stepped forward from the crowd. "I saw it. I saw you and your boys baiting him for a week. I saw you throw the first insult last night. This wasn't about decency. This was about pride, and it was a foul piece of work." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. Mrs. Gable, who had been the sharpest of Clara's critics, refused to meet Boone's eyes, her face pinched with a shame she could not conceal. Boone's arrogant gaze swept over the townspeople, expecting to see the fear and deference he had always commanded. Instead, he saw cold, accusatory stares. He had miscalculated. He had assumed their silence was agreement, their fear was loyalty. He had not understood that in a place this hard, there was a line. A man could be feared. He could be respected for his power, but a coward who shot a man in the back, metaphorically or otherwise, was a different creature altogether. He had shown them his true character, and it was uglier than any past Jonah McGraw might have had. "This town is nothing without me," Boone bellowed, his composure finally cracking. "I own half of it. I can ruin every one of you." "Maybe so," Angus the blacksmith said, his voice a low rumble. "But a man's got to be able to look at his own face in the mirror when he shaves. I'll not be taking your business any longer, Boone. And I'll not be drinking in any saloon that serves you." One by one, others in the crowd nodded their agreement. The spell of fear was broken. They had seen Clara's quiet dignity in the church. They had seen Jonah's restraint. And now they had seen Boone's craven brutality. They had made their choice. Boone stared at them, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He was a king whose subjects had just declared him naked. Without another word, he wrenched his horse's head around and galloped out of town, his men scrambling to follow. He did not look back. He would not return. His power, built on a foundation of intimidation, had crumbled to dust. In the end, it was the town that saved Jonah. They carried him, gently now, to the parsonage, laying him in the Reverend's own bed. Clara, refusing to leave his side, directed his care. Angus's wife, a woman who knew of poultices and fevers, brought herbs. Mrs. Gable, in a silent, grudging act of penance, brought clean linens and broth. They worked together, a community forged at last in the crucible of shared shame and a desperate hope for redemption. The next 2 weeks were a blur of whispered prayers and endless, watchful nights. Clara cleaned his wounds, spoon-fed him water and broth, and talked to him, her voice a low, constant murmur, telling him about the sun on the plains, about the children's lessons, about the town that was slowly, painstakingly, beginning to rebuild. She was teaching him, slowly, that he was not alone. And slowly, he began to heal. The fever broke. The pain began to recede. One afternoon, he opened his eyes and they were clear. He looked at her, and his first word was her name. As Jonah mended, so did the town's relationship with Clara. The council, led by a deeply humbled Reverend Thompson, formally deeded the warehouse lot to her for the school. The men of the town, led by Angus, began to clear the rubble and salvage the good timber. They were rebuilding her school, board by board. The women, who had once whispered behind their hands, now brought her small offerings: a fresh-baked pie, a jar of preserves, a pair of knitted stockings for the coming winter. They were small apologies, clumsy attempts to mend what they had broken. Clara accepted them all with a quiet, simple grace. She had not come here to be liked. She had come here for a chance, and she had earned it. A month after the gunfight, Jonah was on his feet again. He was thinner, and a deep scar on his side would forever mark the night. But he was alive. He was whole. He stood with Clara one morning, watching as Angus and the others raised the first new wall of the schoolhouse. "They're good people," he said, his voice still a little rough.
Just took them a while to see straight.
"Sometimes the light is hard to find in a place with so many shadows," she replied. He looked at her, at the strength in her face, the kindness in her eyes. He had spent his life belonging to no one, and now he belonged so completely to this woman that he could not imagine a world without her in it. Later that week, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet, they rode out of town. They were not leaving. They were just riding. Side by side, Jonah was on his roan, and Clara rode a gentle mare the blacksmith had given her. They rode down the main street of Dry Gulch, past the general store, past the saloon. The people they passed no longer stared with suspicion. They nodded, a quiet acknowledgement, a sign of respect. They were no longer the outcasts. They were a part of the town's story. They rode out onto the plains, into the vast, open country, the air cool and sweet on their faces. They stopped on a low rise. The whole of the red desert spread out before them, glowing in the last light of day. The silence between them was no longer a space to be filled, but a shared peace. Jonah turned in his saddle to look at her. His face, which she had first seen as hard and unreadable, was now an open book to her. She saw his past, his pain, and his future, all there in his steady gaze. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers.
"Show me where,"
he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. It was the echo of his words from the storm, from the heart of his pain. But now, it was not a plea for an end to hurting. It was a question full of a quiet, wondrous hope. "Show me where we go from here. Show me where our life begins." Clara's heart filled with a love so vast it felt as big as the sky above them. She looked at his hand holding hers, at the endless horizon before them, at the small, distant lights of the town they had, against all odds, made their home. Her past was a ghost, and his was a scar, but their future was an open plain, waiting for them to write their own story upon it. She smiled, a genuine radiant smile that lit up her whole face. "Everywhere. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to connect with our audience, so please comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. To help this story reach even more listeners, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.